been in a photo activity on Zoom. So this will be interesting. I'm wearing my COVID shirt here. You can see my little, that's my tagline. And I'm I'm happily healthy. So uh, good thing for you, or otherwise this presentation would be really boring. Okay, I'm stalling here because I'm looking for my PowerPoint. There it is. I found it. Okay, good. All right, so I'm gonna start by sharing my screen. And here we are. There we go.
Looks good.
Great. All right. I think everybody should see that all right?
Yes.
Good. All right. So let's get started. So I'm gonna make sure my mouse is I'm gonna use, different things here. Sometimes I use a laser pointer to point out certain things in the photo. So let's get started. Just a little bit about me, quick bio. So as many people in photography have experienced, they had other career tracks. So I was in technology and other kinds of things in addition to my photography activity. I started doing photography seriously in 1995, and I ended up doing a lot of travel photography professionally for a good, almost 20 years, probably a little beyond that if we count things beyond 2015. I've published 4 books as indicated below, and I've got my Master's of Fine Art in Digital Media from UC Santa Cruz. So I just want to make sure that we're like all on the same page on what we're talking about. The art of critique. And I want to make sure that everybody's clear that this is what we're doing. We are not doing the critique of art. So that is the difference, being we are not going to talk about art. We're not, no, we are, of course, but we're not going to critique art per se. We're going to talk about the art of critique. And I hope that that will be much clearer when we get towards the end of it. Everybody should be pretty clear on what the difference is. So let's review everything we're going to talk about here. So what is art? The essential question people have asked for ages, ever since they started painting on caves. The guy would go to another guy and say, what the hell is that? That is art. And we haven't moved beyond it ever since. So the elements of critique is very important. Photography as an art form. So we are going to cover these 4 different eras of art, not for any other reason than I think they represent a pivotal time that the form of critique about photography took a change. So as everybody's familiar, there's many different styles of photography, many different movements and so forth. But these, I chose these in particular because this is when the style of critique of photography has changed. Then we're going to critique. And that's when you all get sort of really chasing your tail. So let's talk about what it means to critique, to master critique. So let's begin with the act of art production. If you're going to produce artwork, so what you're really doing is you're applying techniques. So in the photography realm, composition rules, lighting, mechanical sciences, f-stop, shutter speed, and so forth. In painting, very similar, but so that is the act of producing art. Mastering an art form is more than just the technique of producing art. Mastering an art form requires producing works that effectively pique some human emotion or experience. So art forms typically reflect on culture, psychology, society, history, philosophy, etc. The list goes on and on. So the act of critique is to contextualize an artwork that you're talking about, or a body of art, or an artist, or an artistic movement. But the act of critique is to contextualize an artwork against the background in which the artist has presented it. Okay, and we're going to talk about that, but we also want to say mastering critique, which is different than the act of critique, is requiring an understanding, right, the artist themselves, their origin story, and evaluating their work against the context that that artist offers, right? So you can see that this is kind of a meta level above it. So if you're going to talk about any of this, you really have to ask the fundamental question of what is art? Well, people have been writing about this for centuries, and there's a lot of different points of view. But for me to talk about the critique and the art of critique, I want to just use a framework that I use. My particular definition of art is what I would call applied philosophy. So what do we mean by that? So philosophy is a framework that explores knowledge, reality, emotions, existentialism, and so forth. So you can think of philosophers and their views on life and so forth. When a philosophical thesis or statement is a uniquely human point of view, a philosophy is a point of view expressed by somebody that reflects their views on these particular topics. So art is a point of view, but expressed in a tangible form. Okay, so what I mean by that is a mountain is not art, but a photo of a mountain is art. Why? Because the photographer chooses a point of view to reflect a particular interpretation. So you would take a picture of a particular subject so that you can reflect what your interpretation is of that subject, right? And your goal is to evoke some sort of contemplation. I think an interesting way to contextualize this idea is if you think of the Copyright Office, what do they allow as a copyrightable work of art? And that is, it has to be a unique perspective. So what do they not accept? Well, they don't accept a picture of a coin, for example, just sitting on a table, sometimes jewelry and so forth, because all these are literal representations of an object that does not really particularly require or use a unique point of view. So many people might and do take that picture. There's no discernible degree of creativity there that at least qualifies for the Copyright Office. So copyright, of course, is just a different thing, but it's an idea that you can use to understand where I'm coming from when I use these things. So if art is a point of view expressed in tangible form, then the question is there good art? Is there bad art? No, because there's no good or bad point of view. So instead, we want to measure art and its impact by the degree in which it elicits dialogue. And we can think of very, famous or not so famous photos that we see. Sometimes it's just a snapshot you do on your phone. You look at it and you go, wow, that's interesting. You share it with somebody, there's dialogue. Well, it's art. It's good or bad. How many people talk about it? To the degree which they do it, this is what we call measuring the impact. So people can talk a lot about controversial art. People can say it's terrible, it's horrible, but if it evokes that degree of discussion And usually if there's that much discussion, there's controversy, which means there's different points of view. So other people coming into it might weigh in on all of that. This, in my definition, means that it has met the definition of art. It is a point of view expressed in a tangible form, and it is evoking contemplation. So the stronger the contemplation, the more it stimulates dialogue, and that can have effect on other ideas. So it can influence philosophies and behaviors, as you know, and we will discuss this. It can change people's point of view about war, about gender identity, all sorts of things. So if art as used as a vehicle to change points of view in other people, once again, it has achieved what I think is the definition of art. So what's the difference between art and just being artistic, right? So here are two illustrations. Both of them are stick figures. And the one on the left is done by, you may or may not recognize him, but he's a famous cartoonist. He does a lot of science cartoons for the New York Times now, to illustrate certain scientific concepts. But this is his signature style. He just uses very simple stick figures. And on the left, I love you, I love you, I love you more. Yeah, and now they're quiet. So that makes you think, right? It makes you think and contemplate, and, you know, so it meets the definition. The one on the right, you know, it's probably some kid drew it and it's cute. And yeah, it's expressing a point of view, an emotion. We feel the emotion. You can share it with your friends. It'll elicit dialogue. I don't know how much dialogue. So both of these are obviously art. The question is, what do you want to do with the art? When is art really achieve a particular degree of activity that elicits dialogue, that raises it up to make people think, you know, on a grander scale? So this is what I call the spectrum of expression, the ability to elicit dialogue. And so it goes from an underdeveloped experimentation, low intention. The artist does not necessarily have the intention to elicit dialogue. As we can see, we have a little toddler who's just scribbling. Then we have the second picture, which is really just a self-portrait of myself when I was growing a beard at the beginning of pandemic. And I thought, oh, let's see what that looks like. I'm not really aiming to do anything, but, you know, it's clearly taken with a unique point of view. I'm deciding to reflect the sun off my glasses. I have low angle light to really accentuate the hairs on my face. So, you know, there's intention there, definitely. It's not like there's lack of intention, but I'm not really there to elicit dialogue. This next picture, you know, how much dialogue does it elicit? Well, by itself, not much, because you don't know much about the guy. He's, you know, just an Arab, right? Or we assume. Now, if I presented this photo along with a larger body of work in a museum where there was a story behind it, and I say, well, this guy was a mastermind behind, you know, 9/11, suddenly this picture would have a lot more weight and impact. But if, on the other hand, he's just a tourist who was just visiting this mosque and he happened to walk out and I just snapped a photo of him and it's a good looking picture. Well, it's a good picture, but how much dialogue does it elicit? Comparatively less, let's just say that. Now, obviously, this last picture on the right is a very famous picture of Vietnam, right? So you don't need to really know a whole lot, but this guy just getting shot point blank just evokes a huge amount of emotion and, of course, dialogue. And it does that without even having to know what this was about, right? So the spectrum of expression is the ability to elicit dialogue. So if you're going to critique, you want to contextualize these elements and put it into a form to communicate to others. So what are the elements of critique? Well, a philosopher or an artist begins with ideas that are shaped from their personal experiences, perhaps, because we're artists, we have a unique point of view, our subjective point of view. So all of our experiences, influence, goals, desires, whatever it is, we begin with that, and then we create something. We create a point of view. So the creator's perspective is expressed in the art form with the intention of inducing contemplation by the viewer. So as artists, we produce something and we expect somebody else to see it. And when they do, we want them to have a particular reaction to it. The viewer's perspective is, of course, similar to the artist's perspective. It is their interpretation comes from their background, their perspective. So now we have two different people. We have the creator and we have the viewer. So their interpretation of what's going on. So that's where the dialogue begins. So it's either the dissonance or the resonance between the artist's intention and the viewer's interpretation that sparks the dialogue, right? You can either completely agree with it, or you can not agree with it, or you can be confused by it, or whatever it is. It's the fact that those two things are now coming together, creating a dialogue. That's what's going on in the production of art. So we're talking about the receiving audience. If there's multiple viewers, besides just one, what language or materials or media or other tools does the creator use to reach a particular audience? Do photographers shoot for other photographers? Do painters paint for other painters? If you're going to put together a political ad, do you target your base or do you target the other side? I mean, everything that you express, commercial, political, personal, doesn't matter what it is. If you're creating something at all, it's a human expression. It requires creativity. It is therefore artwork. So does the artist alter their point of view in order to better reach the audience, to challenge the audience, to challenge a subject? So any of these things, we're now expanding beyond just a viewer to an audience. So does the audience accept or challenge the point of view that the artist presented? So let's look at both of these major bullet points. The philosopher, artist, and the receiving person or audience. Those two things are having a dialogue. So the role of the critic or of the critique is to talk about both of those things. How are those coming together? And we're going to talk about examples of that throughout the rest of this. So let's begin with early interpretations of photography. This is not critique. This is just, wow, they invented this thing. And how do I interpret this? So it's a means of self-reflection and introspection, both literally and metaphorically. The photograph piqued the interest of philosophers and artists alike. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., writing in 1859, so he had about 20 years to look at this. A mirror with a memory, right? The man beholdeth himself in the glass and goeth his own way, and straightway both the mirror and the mirrored forget what manner of man he was. That's a pretty interesting interpretation of what a photograph is and what it can do. The question is going to be interesting. What does it do to society as a result? What do artists do with this new art form? So Holmes's observation foreshadowed a future study of the psychological effect of photographic images. So let's explore some of those. So as many of you are already familiar with, the daguerreotype, this is the inventor, right? Louis-Jacques Daguerre struck a partnership with fellow inventor. I don't need to read this for you, but The point being that it's worth understanding and knowing the technical background. If you were living in this era, this is what you would know, right? So if you're thinking to yourself, do a time travel, go back to these days, understand this is what was going on, and now you have this new technology, and you see this photo, and suddenly there's dialogue waiting to happen. So this is an interesting self-portrait. This is believed to be the earliest American portrait photo. He shot this of himself. And, you know, in the portrait, this guy stands slightly off center with his hair askew. Remember, it took several minutes to actually expose a photo, right? And so not only did there have to be intention, but patience and no empirical experience. It was hard to create anything unique and new simply because nobody's done it before. So you're in that early experimentation phase. So if you remember my spectrum, the child just playing with crayons, it's the discovery mode. I don't know what I have. Let me experiment. These are not really expressions with intention. It is an expression of, oh my God, now I understand what it is that I'm working with. So, you know, this is yet another famous photo. This picture, one of the original photos taken, at least 10 minutes exposure. And what's interesting is you can see right here, there's two people. And this was phenomenal in the day because it is thought to be the first, where does it say? It is but because of, let's see, the movie, where was it? Believed to be the earliest photograph showing a living person. I mean, imagine that, right? Imagine the first time we got a cell phone. I mean, it's one of those first times. It's like just the simple fact that they're here may mean nothing to us. But back then, they were going, wow, that's something interesting. So here is one of the very first known photos used as an ad, as an advertisement. This guy had a photo studio and he sold pictures, right? So what's interesting, people are, he's making an ad. He dresses himself up. He shows this. He's doing what we would expect in advertisements today. He intuitively framed this photo and took it in such a way that there's something intuitively instinctive about certain goals or certain techniques that in order to achieve a particular goal. He wants to sell something. He knows he's going to put a picture up here. He's going to dress in a particular way. So here we have some early formations of artistic styles, you know, to serve a purpose, at least in this particular case. So this is an interesting photograph. This is one of the earliest examples of a news photograph. So this is about a guy stranded on rocks in the Niagara River. And, you know, there's a story here. And you can see this guy, he would later die. And so it's a photograph in an era where people didn't ever have them. And they're looking at a tragic event for the first time. So as a piece of art, you know, how would we judge this, right? In today's N4C camera club competitions. Well, the competition, I mean, look at the framing, the lines, you know, but look, back then it was really something remarkable. So it created a huge amount of dialogue. And this is Portman Square, San Francisco, 1851. I mean, how much rules of composition are we looking at here? this is what I used to call inventory photographs. Whenever I go to a new country, my travel photography, I start looking around. I just start take pictures of everything just to get an inventory of what is there. And I'll later get into more of my artistic expression. So again, before photography was really considered an art form, this is just what people did. So naturally, the next stage is, hey, it's an art. As an art form, how did this evolve from just a technology to a real form of art? So here's where I'm going to get into this topic of the real. There's two forms of real, which only photography really does very effectively. The physical real is the world comprised of matter, which can be captured photographically. But then there's the Lacanian real. Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst, and he identified the real with a capital R as being the realm of ideas that cannot be represented in words or images, that can only be experienced. This was his writing back in the early 20th century. So hunger, love, hate, emotions basically, but not necessarily emotions, right? A pain, and anything that is sort of a esoteric, well, maybe not that, but the point is that you can express hunger, love, hate, all those things in a photograph, but you experience it differently. So what photography can do that's unique is bridge the real world with the Lacanian real, and the emotions and things that are in a different realm. So by combining these two things, now we have an art form that is truly unique, or it certainly can be. But again, with that real experience, photographers really haven't had a chance to explore what's going on here. So what did they do? Naturally, they go back to traditional art forms, pictorialism. So that was the first aesthetic standard of photography, where the goal was to manipulate the image from being just a straightforward photograph, because that was just a physical world, by a means of creating it, right? Here's that concept again of just taking a picture of physical form. That's not creative. It's just a mirror. So how do you make it unique? How do you make it a creative expression? So photos were manipulated in order to do that, right? And so the photos that I'll show next, you can clearly see there's a very different feeling. That's the Lacanian real that we're talking about, with daguerreotypes, physically the same technology, but it is clearly more intentional, staged in a particular way, manipulated in a particular way for the very purpose of evoking an emotion. This almost looks like a Renaissance painting, right? Because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to evoke the same sort of emotion that comes from the art forms they're familiar with. They're remarkable pieces of photography, and you can think of it today, in today's world, they still resonate, right? Stieglitz, of course, being very famous. His most famous, well, not his most famous. My favorite quote from Stieglitz is, "If there's light, there's a photograph. There is no such thing as a bad scene." And he put that to the test by putting his camera, I think it was in the basement or something, and he just let the exposure on just to see what would come out of it. And there was a streak of light that he found the next day. I don't remember the full story, but when you look at that photo, the photo isn't what's interesting. It's what he said about photography. And that photo was an illustration or an example of his commentary. So we have to remember that the photograph doesn't stand by itself. It's contextualized with the artist and what the statements they're trying to make. Colorized, so using all sorts of tinting techniques. The Flatiron Building, we still shoot it today, and it's always fascinating. But this is a composition, I think, were it not for the top hat, it's a composition that, or I should say a picture that you would see today. So it gives you a sense of what is the intuitive photographer's intuition about composition and style, right? Yeah, he's breaking a rule here. No, I'm just kidding. So pictorialism was, if we were to consider that the first artistic movement, there were, as I said, there were many, but modernism really is one of those periods that I think really helped shape photography from the critic point of view, not just the technique, and we're all familiar with that, but the critique of art changed considerably with Group 64, F64, right? So 7 Bay Area photographers use sharp focus and carefully framed images. We're all familiar with this, right? Self-described as engaged in a battle against a tide of oppressive pictorialism. Oppressive, interesting, right? They purposely called their defining proclamation a manifesto, right? So here's part of their manifesto: to define photography as an art form by simple and direct presentation through purely photographic methods. Pure photography is defined as possessing qualities of technique, composition, or an idea, not derivative of any other art form, right? As possessing no qualities of technique, composition, or idea, derivative from another art form. The production of the pictorialist, on the other hand, this is part of their manifesto, indicates a devotion to art forms, painting and photographic arts. So their goal was to say, photography, pure photography, really is not supposed to look like other photographic arts, or I'm sorry, other graphic arts. So he suggested distinctive individual viewpoints, technical and emotional, achieved without departing from the simplest aspects of straight photographic procedure, right? So phenomenal photographs, phenomenal photographers, and of course they had a huge impact on society, right? They helped popularize the national park. They created strong emotional impact of the Western United States. So as art forms, they created a huge amount of dialogue, affected a great deal of policy. So I don't want to dwell too much on it, but here we're looking at whether macro or micro compositions. All of these photos really illustrate an emotion that really only photography can do. So here we're going back to the roots. We're taking an actual photograph, just like the daguerreotypes of straight things, but now we have more intention, right? We're back to that word of intention. These photographs are intended to evoke a strong emotion, whereas the first daguerreotypes, they were just capturing catalog. They were just cataloging the world and experimentation with new physical technology. So now let's move on to pop art in the 1960s, right? And by the way, I'm not paying attention if somebody has a question or a statement, or No? Okay. The rise of pop art movement capitalized on the emotional impact of imagery, right? So Hal Foster is a art critic who wrote copiously about art in general. And he refers to the punctum that pierces through the screen that formally stands between our physical senses and reality, calling a traumatic encounter with the real a thing that resists the symbolic. I mean, that really takes some time to really think about and digest, especially when you put it in the framework of the pieces of art that he was frequently talking about. And photography was certainly in that realm. This punctum, once again, the physical real and the Lacanian real, that those two have this screen between them, and he punctures right through it. Is basically what he's saying, that the power of photography and a lot of pop art in general, you know, Warhol being, you know, famously known for this, is what it's. So here's a couple of pictures that Warhol presents. Now, he didn't take the pictures, but he took news photography. And what is he doing? He's putting two copies of it here, right? And why does he do this? If we go back to this, pierces through the screen that stands between our physical senses and reality, a traumatic encounter with the real. And the shocking imagery is coupled with repetition, alluding to Freud's description of how we deal with trauma. If something traumatic happens to you, and I'm not going to list things because that would be traumatic, but you play it over and over and over in your mind. You can't get rid of it. When bad things happen, you just repeat it. And that's what Freud, you know, would say happens to trauma. And so Warhol is doing that here. He's taking news photographs and presenting it to you in repetition to have you experience this, or to be reminded that it is experienced over and over. And so if this piece of art was presented for the first time to an audience, what would their interpretation be? And the role of the critic, when they critique these works of art, they're looking not just at the pictures and the intention and the background, but they're also looking at the audience. What's their response? Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. They don't care. What the critic's role is to tell this story so that we who read the critique can understand it and put it into context. Oh, here's this guy Warhol. He put these pictures together, put them in a museum. People were offended. They hated it. They were just, they came out terrible. The role of the critic in his critique is, did he achieve his objective? Did he have the audience feel revolted? As a critique, I would say, yes, he did. He achieved that. And what does that say to us about society? In the 1960s, it's just not that long after World War II. We were rebuilding, we were coming back, the revolution, this is before the civil rights movement, but we're certainly getting into that, right? 1964. So we're challenging a lot of things going on, and that's what Warhol's purpose, his intention was. And so as a critique, what are the goals of critique? To master critique is to put into context, what is the artist's background? What's he trying to do? Is he achieving it with these pictures? And how do we measure that achievement? By the reaction of the audience. So this Lacanian real versus reality, this dance between the Lacanian real and the physical real lies in perception. So Kathy Caruth explores the fundamental enigma concerning the psyche's relation to reality. an enigma. Isn't that interesting? As a critique, I would find that enigma, I want to understand, is the artist achieving this conflict between somebody's reaction to reality and their Lacanian real, right? It's hard to understand whether they've done it because it's such an enigma. We don't really know it ourselves, or I should say, we know it when we see it. So citing traumatic events as a mechanism that triggers the following paradox. The most direct seeing of a violent event may occur as an absolute inability to know it, which is a profound way to comment on the efficacy of these kinds of photographs, right? So a traumatic reality is difficult to express. Photographs of violent events such as war can be effective as well as effectless, depending on the perception of the viewer. And these are things that I think are unique to photography, that we have this ability. It's hard to, not that it hasn't been done or can't be done, but a painting of something, it takes you one step removed from the physical real and the trauma of war and death and so forth, depicted as a photograph, really puts it front and center in the viewer's face. So Cindy Sherman photographed this dead body, right? This dead woman. And when this is presented, viewers would be shocked that there was an actual dead person. This crosses the uncanny valley, right? The uncanny, what Freud described as, it looks human and real, but it's different enough that it causes this dissonance, this strong discomfort. And Cindy Sherman was really well known for this sort of effect. So what is the role of the critique? Does she achieve this effect? What is the effect of having achieved it? How does the audience change it? How does the audience view things? How has Cindy Sherman changed dialogue because of the way she's presented this photograph? So this gets into postmodern photography, seeking truth, including whether there is truth, a trend towards objectivity, right? So all of the other photos that we just saw, they're not really intended to be objective. They certainly can be, and they have been, but their goal wasn't to be objective. They're not saying, I'm standing away from this and you make up your own mind, which is where that postmodern photography begins. So Errol Morris points out that a photograph is neither true or false. All photographs are posed. They can exclude something, but you can never see the absence of something in a photograph. The photographer chooses where to stand, where to aim the camera, what to include and what to exclude. The only time you can actually know about something is to investigate. So that's Errol Morris. So here's a famous photo from Ben Curtis. A child's toy lies amidst broken glass from the shattered windows of an apartment block near those that were demolished by Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon. So this was a very powerful, moving, persuasive photo, but it was also heavily criticized. Where did the mouse come from? Did he put it there? Did he stage this? So you can see now that this movement towards photography is got to be objective, that it's supposed to tell us a truth that we don't otherwise have access to. We're not going to go to Lebanon, but we want to see what's going on there. So we rely on news photography. That was the new thinking about photography, much earlier than 2006, of course, but I'm using this to illustrate what has been a challenge with that photography is truth thesis. Ever since that photo was taken, here's all these other news photographers that pretty much did the same thing. So the controversy surrounding this, plus the impact and effect that it had, we now see a lot of these things. What do we make of that? If we were a critic, our job is not to say in a judgment way, well, everybody's copying this. This is, you can do that as a critic, but if I were the critic in the era that this was going on, I would say there seems to be a trend towards, now you can hear the tone of my voice and the words that I use, passive voice. I'm trying to do what the photograph is trying to do and trying to be objective. Trying to say, apparently there's a lot of these, and I think we can expect a lot more. The impact has been, public opinion has turned, politicians are reacting this way, all because of these photographs. So truth or manipulation? Ben Curtis, that AP photographer, Photoshop manipulation is one thing, caption manipulation is another thing. And there's also a question of editing in terms of picture selection. The pictures you select to give to the journal, to your employer, out of all the ones you shot. So you have no choice, because you are a human. You are going to be biased towards whatever you think is not biased, right? The ultimate paradox. A photo can be technically true, but its context can be emotionally manipulative, right? So we're now once again back to that whole thesis of the physical real and the Lacanian real, the emotional manipulation. Photos of war, crime, famine, natural disasters, they can have all great influences on public perception, right? So what about fake photos? How do we evaluate them as works of art? Same rules apply. We contextualize it. We evaluate that emotional impact. What are the societal effects? And how do we alter our critique of fake photos? So once again, the critique is not the same as judgment. Oh, that photo is a fake, therefore, that photo is a fake, and therefore it had this effect. What do we think of that effect? How do we contextualize that? So here's this 1936 cow skull photo controversy. It's a fake, says the newspaper. Fell for this gem among phony pictures, right? So what makes this accusation of fakery utterly perverse is that they claimed that this, he did place it there, but he did it in order to sort of evoke that emotion that the Dakotas were experiencing one of the worst droughts in history. So what's wrong with that? What's interesting is that the point of view about faking a photo has changed over the years, yet it also hasn't changed. Crimea, 1855, which is true, a road with cannonballs or road without cannonballs? So here are the cannonballs, if you can't see it, right? And they're not here. I'm sorry. Well, they're everywhere, but. So Roger Fenton shot 2 pictures and then put cannonballs there. So what do we make of that? So I get back to my thesis again. Critiquing is not judging. The most vexing issues in photography about posing, about the intention of the photographer, about the nature of photographic evidence, are all about the relationship between the photographs and reality. But which reality, the physical real or the Lacanian real? Judging the ethics of photography as a tool for persuasion is not the same as critiquing it. A successful critique involves understanding not just the photograph, the backstory, the players, the intentions, the outcomes, gathering it all together to help the audience understand the broader context. So then there's the ultimate meta, right? Critique is itself a particular point of view, that of the critiquer. So we've seen many different critiques of a movement, of an artwork, and so forth. So artwork evolves alongside culture and society. So the critiques of artworks must also be understood to be framed on the context of that time. So to critique art from the past, we must also critique the critiques of the works at that time. How were they perceived then? And if we're going to critique that work at that time, do we not take into account what the critics of that time thought? And, you know, we're living in a time of great social change right now. So Gone with the Wind, the movie that, you know, everybody's familiar with, won Academy Awards, so on and so on. Suddenly, in the era of Black Lives Matter, not that this is the first time it's come up, but they took it offline. Now they're putting it back, but they're putting it back with some explanations and so forth. So if we were to critique that movie, would we critique it in today's context, or would we critique it in the original context? And if we did the original, should we not also incorporate the critique of that time? As a critique, which is itself a form of art, you are expressing a point of view, your point of view, with your background and your values and so forth. If you're going to present a context to say what your point of view is in your critique of something. So that's how this gets all meta, right? One critique and they all stack up. So I hope this has given a lot of people a lot of time to think and contemplate. So that's it. I tried to make it an hour. I think I succeeded. People still there? Hello?
Yep, here we go. No. If people have questions, Alt-Y or Option-Y on a Mac, raise your electronic hand and we'll unmute you.
I only had one glass. Bing.
All right.
Good.
Phil?
Excellent.
Phil, you're on. You have to unmute yourself, though.
Am I still sharing my screen?
You are. You want me
Yeah.
to?
Oh, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
if people want me
Hi,
to go
Dan,
to a
this is Phil
particular.
Shaw. I invited you to come, and I'm very glad that you gave your talk. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you, sir. I know there's a lot there. It's a lot to digest.
Definitely give us some things to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, the issue of critiquing, you know, the changing times, changing attitudes, changing mores, and how we look at things that were critiqued in a different way years ago is, you know, it's certainly ripe for conversation. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions? Raise your hand.
Don't feel obligated, but I'm always here to.
Well, quiet. Well, here we go. Mary, I saw your hand a second ago. Mary, you
Yeah.
there?
So, yeah, I was just going to say that it was very educational, and I was thinking it was going to be more on, what we all think of as critiquing, um, monthly critiques and all. So actually, it was a nice alternative way of talking about critique, more like the history and all kinds of other ways of thinking about it. So I thought it was really interesting.
Well, great. I'm glad I didn't let you down. I know it was not expected.
Yeah.
I didn't send a preview of what I was going to talk about. But
Well, it was yeah, it was good. It might have, I mean, I was thinking it might, because people are so quiet, that it might have just been so different than what they were expecting.
Yeah.
Definitely different angle than I thought, but certainly very interesting.
Right.
Meryl, did you have a question? You can unmute if you'd like.
Okay, I was having a difficult time unmuting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very, very well done and very educational. I also was thinking more of judging rather than critiquing, which seems to be a whole other aspect unto itself. It was a very informative, and I enjoyed it very much. So thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate that. I have spoken on judging, but I didn't want to do that here.
Well, we, in the club, we kind of think of critiquing as judging.
Yeah, I know.
It one word is synonymous with the other one.
Yeah.
But this
Well,
was very interesting as to how to look at other images in a different form.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Yeah, certainly as when I put my photojournalist hat on, and certainly when we talk about our travel photography or journalism or nature, making any changes to an image at all we can't do it. It's ethically something that we can't do. So to see the images of all of a sudden these toys in the foreground of all these other photographers' images who are supposedly photojournalists, supposedly having the same ethical standards, raises an awful lot of questions.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to imply that because I don't know, but I didn't mean to imply that all those photos were staged. Who knows? Toys really do, buildings blow up and they really do land, in places, and photographers position themselves to take a picture that way. And, the Errol Morris, when he, in the longer article that I was using in that quote, he brings up all sorts of things. It's like, when is it a lie? If I move or not move the toy into position, I can move myself to be in position. How is that different is what he's asking. And I think that, especially in the context of my presentation here, this is a very interesting and provocative question. Where does a lie begin and where does a lie end?
Well, there's no question. I've been shooting protest marches now for 3.5 years, and there's absolutely no question that we as photographers position ourselves to capture the story that's in our heads. It's, we try and be neutral at times, but
Right.
there are times where we are shooting for a particular side of things, and you're looking, what is the story here? I've had colleagues of mine who say, well, you shouldn't you shouldn't take the pictures of protesters who are violent because, well, you'll get them in trouble. Well, there's a whole story there of, well,
Yeah.
that's part of the
There's a story
story. That's
there.
part of the story. That's part of their decision.
Yeah.
So as a photojournalist, where do you draw that line? So
Mhm.
that question comes up certainly all the time. And for
right.
us, as when we are doing our photography for our competitions and trying to tell a story, we are positioning ourselves or framing the shot to tell a particular story.
James?
Jim, let me raise your hand there. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. What you've said has been extremely interesting. For me, listening to you, as I've always thought, things are a point of reference. And what I mean by that is your critique of an image is different than my critique of the same image. So trying to understand that story and express that story to another in communication, and to be able to explain that story in my point of view so that you understand that story would be different than you understanding that story and explaining it to me. So if you are the person of reference, then you would understand it differently than I would understand it. And if you were basically that point of reference vis-a-vis a judge, then certainly your judging would definitely be different than mine. And the person that captured that image certainly would have a different story than both of us.
Right. It's not just your comment, but all the previous comments about, I thought this was going to be more about judging. And it is an interesting thing. I had a slide there that you remember. It says critique is not judging.
That's correct.
And I think, for the benefit of one's own understanding of judging, put judging in the context of a much larger framework. And that is, we have the artwork, we have judging, and then we have critiquing. And what I've hoped to do here is understand where the dividing lines are, thin and gray and vague though they may be. There is a difference between judging and critiquing.
Absolutely.
Right? So critiquing, if I could, at the risk of oversimplification, critiquing is an attempt to be as neutral as a judge as possible. It's trying to take a very neutral judgment. If I were to judge a photo, I would make it very specific to my point of view. This is what I think. Here's how I reacted. Here's what I think could have done or should have done. That's judging. Critiquing is saying, well, let me understand where you're coming from, and let me understand where the audience is coming from, and let me put both of those into context and explain to everyone else, this is what's happened. This is what I see that just happened here. So in a way, I'm trying to be as objective as I can for another audience about the art and the audience in the smaller context.
Which brings the point objective and subjective.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. John Nygren? Thank you, Jim.
I found your presentation very intriguing. and I'd like to go back and study it some more. But where it's really going to affect me is how I look at pictures in a gallery. For instance, I don't like Andy Warhol. And so what he is doing, he's creating the effect on me that he intended for some of his photos, because I don't like it. That's probably that he wanted a negative effect.
Yeah, when I was doing my MFA, interestingly enough, there was this whole discussion, would put it lightly, between the teacher and the students on what is the purpose of a museum? What are they supposed to what are they supposed to show us? Are they supposed to show us stuff that we like? Right. So you can go to Andy Warhol. I mean, look, there's a reason why I used that cartoon in my presentation. Right. I'm gonna do it again. Right. There's a reason why there's this picture. And I think it's important for all of us to understand, when you go to a museum, you're not really supposed to just look at the pieces of work. You're supposed to understand the broader framework. I mean, all museums will have pamphlets or sometimes audio things that they explain the photographer, they explain what their goals were, their history, their background, something to contextualize these works of art and what they meant and what kind of effect they had maybe on the photographer, or I'm sorry, the artist or society and so forth. Sometimes when Andy Warhol is presented in museums, sometimes the goal really isn't about Andy Warhol at all. It's just about Andy Warhol's effect on the pop art movement that started, in the 50s and 60s. And if you can use all sorts of artwork. You can use artwork to tell all sorts of stories, or you can tell stories to explain artwork. But I think that you make a very interesting and discussion-worthy point to say, when you go to Andy Warhol and his works in the museum, you don't like them. Well, they're not there to be liked or not liked. The goal isn't to present. It's not a catalog of pictures where you go, oh, wow, isn't that nice? Your goal is to hear a story framed by the curators of the museum. They're the ones who are putting the story together. And it would be like, going through a child's book written in another language, and you look at all the pictures, but you don't understand the captions, and you go, well, I don't know what this story was about. Right. So I didn't mean to go off too far on that tangent, but I do think museums is an interesting place to explore this question of judging versus critiquing.
Hey, Dan, we're down to a fairly small group, and I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is to basically allow people to unmute their own microphones and just kind of open the discussion up for a little bit. We've got a few minutes left.
Sure.
So let me do that. Meryl, I think you had a question. Let me call on you first. But if you want to speak,
Yes, I got it.
if wait a second, if you want to speak and you have your cursor anywhere in this Zoom box, just press your space bar, and it will. If you hold your space bar, it will allow you to talk. You don't have to unmute the microphone. That will unmute your microphone for as long as you're talking. Okay, Meryl, sorry, go ahead. You're muted again.
Meryl.
Meryl, press your space bar and talk.
Oh, okay, got it.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
And just hold it. Yep, you're good.
Okay. It brings me back to the picture of the Vietnamese man who's getting shot in the head. There are different ways of looking at that picture, depending on who's looking at it. Some people might look at that picture and say, yay, he's getting shot in the head. Other people may look at that picture and say, this is terrible. This kind of thing has to stop. So is there a right and a wrong as to what one is seeing in the picture. What was the photographer's intention when he took the picture? Was it to shock people, to make them say this is a horrible thing? Or was it to show that we are killing the Vietnamese? I mean, that's very hard to decide which side to be on.
Well, so that's why the role and the job of the critic is more than just to judge a photograph. The role of the critic is to answer the question for you, or I should say, answer your question. So if I'm going to be in the role of the critic right now, I'm going to say that photograph was shot at a time when the Vietnam War in the United States was highly controversial. And there were, movements to end the war, as you probably well know. Nixon was really trying to fight a war on two fronts. He had the civil rights war in his mind in the United States, and he had the Vietnam War. And his popularity, as he ran in 1968 on Law and Order, right? So all of the riots going on that led to his, election in 1968 or re-election in 72. He was fighting this war, and he was also fighting the Vietnamese War. So the Vietnam War was all over the news media. It was in newspapers. There were only 3 TV stations, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and they were covering it nightly news. So when this photo came out, this wasn't a shocker, so to speak. I mean, yeah, it was. It was not a surprise. There were already, the Vietnam War was the first war ever fought with television cameras. All wars before that did not have TV crews. So this was the first war that was actually viewable from people's living rooms. So that photo came out at a time that people were used to being front and center against this. And it really just showed the horrors of what was going on. So this didn't come out of nowhere.
But Dan, this is that particular photograph. And I'm not sure I remember the entire story. I've read bunches of things about it. So
You want me to bring it up?
That particular photojournalist who was there caught that. I don't think there was any intent on his part in terms of taking that, other than he was there at that moment, took the shot. But the backstory speaks an awful lot to what you're talking about in terms of what a critique is all about, in terms of understanding the situation. The impact of that particular photograph in the US without an understanding of the background was almost diametrically opposite to what was happening at that moment. My understanding was the guy who was being shot had just brutally killed a whole bunch of people in the area, and this was the general's reaction to it. Obviously not under color of law, but without the backstory of that, someone looking at this has one idea of what was happening. Gee, this awful general shooting the guy in the head, where there was whole nother story attached to it. So the impact that this had without the backstory was very different than what it would have been if people understood the backstory. And the particular photographer's taking of this didn't have intent in any way whatsoever. He wasn't really trying to tell a story other than the fact that he was there and then submitted the story to his editors.
Right. And you did a much better job at, I was trying to be more meta above that, and I shouldn't have. You summarized it quite well.
Yeah.
And it, I think it helps support where I was trying to go with this, in that you don't judge the photo per se because there's too much story behind it that
Mhm.
needs to be understood,
Mhm.
which you just described very well.
Dan, was there a critic for the story? In effect, the caption writer or the person who described what was happening or did not describe it?
Yeah, you know what? When I was familiar with this, and I just frankly forgot. So I apologize. I don't have all that.
Steve, it's Meryl. I did not know that backstory. And that really, I think that that may change the way I feel about that picture. So,
Yeah,
So
and I
that's-
remember at the time because I was out there in the streets protesting against the war and saw that photo and was like, oh gee, you know, another horrible thing, you know, gee, another thing we're doing out there. And then 30 years later, 40 years later, I hear the backstory and somebody had interviewed the general and the person, I forget who the photographer was, but they had interviewed him at the time. And yeah, this guy had gone around and just shot a whole bunch of innocent people and then got caught and executed on the spot.
well, you know, all this works for journalism, but in critiquing, like you had that beautiful Ansel Adams picture of Half Dome. What's the story on that? How do you critique something like that? Is it a beautiful picture? Is it not a beautiful picture? Where does one go in their head with talking about a photo like that?
Well, your question is, how do you critique it? Critiquing it is different than judging it. And that's been my goal with this presentation. To critique it means, what is the background of the photographer? What's their backstory? How is this photograph used? What is the effect of its use? And how did people respond? So the whole Ansel Adams story is about shooting the West, and those photos were used to promote the creation of national parks, or the expansion of national parks, and for people to visit the West and to appreciate nature. And the effect was very strong and profound. So to critique the photo has to put all of that into the story. To judge the photo, the rest of that story is interesting, but it doesn't matter. To judge the photo, we would use your judging techniques, right? How's the composition and the lighting and, you know, all of that. So you follow where I'm trying to go with that?
I do. Thank you very much.
Great.
Aren't we, we're kind of involved in the monster from the id here. You have to rely, when you're critiquing this, you're relying on the expertise of the individual that's doing the critiquing. You're relying on his ability to be able to do the decent presentation. You're relying on his intentions, on what he wants to present and why he wants to present it. You're relying on the background story. And if another person was doing it, his intentions, background story, and everything else would be different.
Yeah.
So where are we going here is what I'm trying to say. I don't know at this point.
Well,
We all see the world through our own filters of experience and
Yeah.
culture and everything else. And I know I get so frustrated with judges who don't see the image that I saw. It's like, what do you mean you didn't place it? This was a great image. Knowing that the next judge is going to have their own filters. And,
yeah.
Well, I'm not really coming from judging here. I'm coming from passion.
yeah.
I'm coming from looking at an image and saying, wow, this is really a great image. But I'm coming from me. And that's what I was alluding to earlier. You know, it's one thing to be able to look at an image and see how I see it and appreciate the fact that another person is looking at it and seeing it differently than I am. You know, you have to understand that.
So what is truth, Jim?
I don't know, Meryl. I don't. And I'm always trying to seek something that is reasonable, not only in judging, but being able to do a decent critique. unto myself. I'm waiting for a comment from Dan.
Well, I think you summed, I mean, you summed it up quite well. This is all subjective. We're all individuals. And as Errol Morris said, there is no truth that's objectively independent of all of us as individuals. We are all individuals. We have a point of view, and we're going to take in and interpret what we see. We're going to use our background, our experiences, our passions and fears and biases as judges, as critiques, as artists. Everything is one. And so when you have a collection of humans that are by definition all biased towards their own experiences or influences and so forth, where is truth? How do you even define what truth is? Right? That's the philosophical assessment question that Errol Morris was trying to say about photography. It is not either truth or false. It is nothing more or less than the point of view of the person who took the picture.
Yes, but also at some point we have to be objective.
Well, you can try, right? It's an asymptote. You can get closer and closer, but you'll never really reach it because you can't even, how do you define what objective is? It's everything is through the lens of history and of our values at that time. That's why I used the Gone with the Wind. It was once considered this masterful, great piece of work, and now it's considered to be racist, and that's because times have changed. I'm sure there's many people who've always thought it was racist, and people are only just now coming around. But that, I think, is the wonderful part of art and in photography in particular, because as things change and evolve, as we change, as individuals change, as society around us changes, so does the art and its expression and its interpretation and its later, assessments as time goes on. The fact that it is fluid and it will never really sit still, I think, is one of the best qualities of it.
And I think that's a great way to end tonight.
Thank you, Dan. You are now my hero.
Wow.
No, it's
Dan, on behalf of the club, thank you so much. This is a very, I don't even say it, a thought-provoking discussion, and kind of a discussion we haven't had before in this forum. And I want to thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
yes.
Good night, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Hi.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.